our direction.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to follow my honourable friend from Bridgend. I think the most important thing that we can do is to, without sounding too dramatic, is to avoid conflict with the Russian Federation. And everything that I say is predicated on that simple point. It is also predicated on the fact that our adversary is the Kremlin and not the Russian people. Having said that, I think there's three things that I'd like to focus on in this brief speech. We need to accept, we need to understand, and we need to act. We need to accept that we are in a new Cold War with the Russians. I know some people don't like using that term, but I think it's valid and honest. We need to accept that President Putin is trying to undermine the current state system. He is trying to break it, and in his final term may well try for a more aggressive gamble. I think to say, when we have troops on the Russian border ourselves, that there is not a potential existential threat, a potential one, I think is complacent. And I say that with great respect to those people who've argued against that point. Secondly, I think we need to understand. We need to understand the nature of Russia's new warfare and, in general, the global threat that authoritarian states now pose to free societies. And thirdly, we need to act. Not in a shouty, finger-painting, pointing, stick-waving kind of way, but in a consistent and robust manner. And we need to relearn the art of deterrence, and frankly, we need to relearn the art of strategy. We are in a new Cold War. The definition of a Cold War is a state of political hostility between countries characterised by threats, by propaganda, and by other measures short of open war. This is not the Cold War, but it is a Cold War. It's probably been ongoing. We haven't wanted to recognise it since about 2007. It was probably announced by President Putin in his Munich security speech, and it's probably been in the planning since 2000. But if you're in Moldova or Georgia or these places, as I was in the early 1990s, you saw the initial revisionist push by the Russian state or by elements within the security services, Siloviki, back in the late 1990s as the Soviet Union was collapsing. Next, we need to understand. Hybrid war is one of about 25 terms that I think have been used thus far. It is broadly a sophisticated and integrated form of state control based on multiple forms of state power used in a highly coordinated and coercive fashion. It's basically the old active measures KGB warfare, disinformation, political proxy, armed groups, assassinations, around which has been gathered the full spectrum of state power. In the research that I've been doing in the past few years, there are at least 50 tools. And indeed, the first characteristic of Russian contemporary warfare is what it calls the integrated use of military and non-military tools. So what we see as hybrid war, we get the bear bombers, so there's a bit of the military aspect as well. What we see as hybrid war, the trolls, the hackers, the gangsters, this is the usable element of a full spectrum, which includes nuclear weapons, nuclear theory, conventional weapons, as my friend from Aurelian and Wickford, the point that made earlier. So this is a full spectrum, and indeed in Russian warfare, and it is important for us to note, especially people who are not favourable to this argument, the Zapad Western exercises conducted every year, not in every single one of them, but in many of them it ends with a nuclear strike. Now, as anyone who knows, who's participated in military exercises, you do not plan for fantasy scenarios. You plan for most likely course of action or most dangerous course of action. If the Russians plan the use of nuclear strikes on cities in Eastern Europe as part of a gambit, as part of a tactic, one has to take that seriously. They're not doing it for a laugh, they're doing it because they're testing and looking at options. These tools, I think Russian power tools can be divided into 6. Politics and political violence, governance, economics and energy, military power, diplomacy and public outreach, information, narrative and warfare. All wrap around command and control, which in our world is surprisingly short and goes up to Putin in not very many stages, which is rare because compared to the West you have endless sort of brigade, division, command, control before you get to a political level. This is a highly political, Clausewitzian, I think is the term, form of warfare. Finally, last 2 minutes, we need to act. Russian warfare is holistic and full spectrum. Our response should be too. On top of the good things that this government has already done, and I echo completely my honourable friend from Bridgend, her point, we need a commission Back in the 1980s, Senate Intelligence Committee did wonderful work methodically exposing Russian disinformation. We need Parliament or government to establish a working group, an organisation of some kind that needs a UK and global remit to ruthlessly look into Russian full-spectrum warfare and expose it, so we can tell our own people what we're doing, we can tell the Greeks and people in Cyprus and people in France, we can tell the world. This is important. I have suggested this before, and it would be wonderful to get some traction with my right honourable friend. Financial authority stuff, I mean, I think we should just adopt Transparency International's list, but I won't touch that because I know we're doing a good work on that. Let's introduce a named list for agents of Russian influence in the UK, including, let's tighten up members of the House of Lords who do work and who've been working for some very questionable oligarchs, some of the, I understand. Let's work also. The US this week is bringing in a counter-propaganda bill which puts a health warning on authoritarian broadcasters operating in the West. Our need for that is, the Russians may well respond in kind. I don't care. We need to protect our democracy and we need to protect our elections. And the time to realise our elections are being meddled with is not midway during a campaign, it is before. Yes, we've got 30 seconds.
Thank you for giving my... On the issue of misinformation, does he agree that money spent on negative messaging is much more damaging than effort that we can counter with positive messaging? Because negative messaging undermines the voter and is much more difficult to counter with the positive.
Thank you very much. Yes, and you make a very good point. And if you look at Russian tactics, it's not building up brand A as opposed to brand B. It is just destroying brand B, which is what they did with Hillary Clinton. They weren't really concerned about being nice to Donald Trump, but what they wanted to do was destroy any opposition. So I suggested in one of the Sunday papers that what they do is they break into the service of both political parties and then ruthlessly leak the information in as damaging a way as possible from one, and they would do that in the weeks and months before an election campaign. That is a bit of a modus vivendi. But thank you very much indeed for that point. What else? Work with the US and NATO. It's great having a few hundred troops in the Baltic. It is entirely negligible in the great scheme of things, frankly, especially when the Russians are building up missile dominance, tactical nuclear weapons dominance and conventional dominance. We need to think in NATO what sort of things we're doing to counter this, because once you counter and block off the Russian threat, you are more likely to get them to talk, and my fear is that they will not do so. We need to offer a grand bargain to Ukraine. The Prime Minister mentioned some money being sent to Ukraine, 42 million in total. It is very small amounts of money. The weaker Ukraine is, the more likely you will have great instability in Eastern Europe. We need to block the Russians in the Balkans, and we need to do so soon before they export the managed conflict model there. And we need to properly fund the BBC World Service, and we need to boost the Russian service more than is being done, but good work so far. And finally, I would suggest we need to look at the visa regime to allow ordinary Russians here and prevent oligarchs, dodgy oligarchs coming, rather than the other way around. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.